This is David Ross, and welcome once again to the Lions Roar podcast. What I wanted to talk about today was what I think is an important relationship and should be seen as a potential partnership between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Shuai Jiao. But already I need to clarify that. When we talk about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I'm talking much more about the original Gracie family Jiu-Jitsu, as opposed to the more modern aspects of it, which has become a little bit more, I'm loath to use the term, but sport-oriented, and International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation, competition-oriented, moving away a little bit from the emphasis of the original Gracie family and their particular emphasis on not just the rolling, which has become the sport, but the self-defense aspects and the Vale Tudo or challenge aspects. By the same motion, same meaning, when I talk about Shuai Jiao, I'm talking here about specifically the Shuai Jiao that I do, and a lot of people do, which is from Cheng Dongsheng's lineage, which is a form of Baoding, but Baoding school, but is very importantly, Cheng Dongsheng's own personal experiences and the way that he developed his method. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So again, talking about Gracie family Jiu-Jitsu, or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu as it was known, this complication arising from, in the 90s, some legal disputes that resulted in using the term Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And the Cheng Dongsheng version of Shuai Jiao. And like I said, when we talk about Shuai Jiao, of course, there's classical Shuai Jiao. I don't know why recently it's been a big subject of discussion, but if we use wrestling in a generic term, wrestling has existed in China for a very, very long time under different names and in different formats, and some of it more martial than others. When we talk about Shuai Jiao now, we're talking about classical Shuai Jiao, a form of standing grappling with no groundwork, with its origins in what they was called the Shampuying, which was with the Manchurian, the Qing dynasty, a group that was started. And one of their primary uses, as I've discussed before, was a kind of diplomacy where they Manchurian wrestlers engaged in wrestling matches with Mongolian wrestlers. But we already know that Shampuying is not a completely non-martial. They were bodyguards, and especially once the Shampuying broke up and they went out into the regular world, they were part of the Jianghe, the subculture. They had schools and, did performances on the streets and, had to defend their territories. And just in general, we know that wrestlers are very tough people. But when we talk about Cheng Dongsheng, first we're talking about the Baoding school. Now, definitely a direct relationship between the Baoding school and the Shampuying, but Baoding is already somewhat differentiated from other classical schools of Shuai Jiao, and like for example Shuai Jiao that we see on the mainland and see them published in books and videos from the mainland, because the basically godfather of Baoding said that he included Shaolin Chuan into the system. And of course, being clear here, Shaolin Chuan is sort of a generic name for the kind of long arm, long fist methods, in Hebei and Henan and, that surrounding area. But it was already somewhat different. But with Cheng Dongsheng, of course, we know that his Shuai Jiao is not only Baoding, but it's also greatly influenced by his training and teaching at the Central Goshu Academy, and by his experience preparing, military and police. And it makes it very different, and we'll talk about that tonight. We talk about Gracie family Jiu-Jitsu, or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, as I said. Again, somewhat controversial, but probably less controversial now. There's some very good stuff coming out about this. The Closed Guard Project, which is like books and a documentary and some blog posts and stuff that you can read. It's not as much Jiu-Jitsu in the classical Jiu-Jitsu terms, that if we think about, like, Jiu-Jitsu that was done by samurai, warriors in armor, but it's more pre-war judo, and that's going to be important as I talk more about why I think there is an inherent relationship and a good possibility to cross-train between Shuai Jiao and Gracie Jiu Jitsu. Kano, among his many brilliant innovations in the way that he was able to take a relatively obscure, unpopular Japanese martial art and turn it into a internationally practiced and respected sport, was establishing ethical standards and his concern for the reputation. It is often stated in histories of judo that when Kano was doing jiu-jitsu, it was no longer obviously being practiced by samurai, by elite caste warriors. It had sort of filtered down into the general population. It was often affiliated or had a reputation of being affiliated with gangsters, thugs, and toughs. And so one of the things that Kano wanted to do was sort of rehabilitate that reputation. And keeping that in mind, there's always tensions about this because, even under Kano's leadership, they did some challenge matches. The police college matches, probably stand out the most. But a lot of people that were training under him or were affiliated with him were still sort of engaging in challenge matches, wanting to prove the method. So you had people like, Kande Koma, Count Combat, Maeda, who... and he was not the only one, clearly. We know in Europe and in, the Americas, people affiliated with judo engaged in challenge matches, worked in early pro wrestling, which is different than the pro wrestling that we have today, obviously. Some of the matches, what we would call worked, and some of them being real. Some challenge matches, the carnival thing. And frequently, because they didn't want to impugn the reputation of Kano or his judo, and they did not want the consequences of perhaps Kano finding out about them using the term judo and being angry with them, for affecting the reputation. Frequently, they use the term jiu-jitsu. And so you see like matches which were advertised as wrestling versus jiu-jitsu, catch wrestling versus jiu-jitsu. You see boxing versus jiu-jitsu. You see these carnival challenge matches and stuff. Really wasn't jiu-jitsu, it was pre-war judo. But they used that term. And this influenced the Gracie family. In fact, when you look at stuff like the Closed Guard Project, like I said, the Gracie family themselves were not only involved in the challenge match angles, obviously, which everybody knows about, but were also involved in these sort of, circus, carnival, pro wrestling kind of promotions and events. Excuse me. So, it's not surprising that when we start looking closer at Gracie Jiu Jitsu, we see how much of a relationship it has to pre-World War II judo. I'm working for some notes here because I want to keep my focus. Modern judo, as we know it now, obviously has the competition, the Olympics, which became a big deal, and a passing acknowledgement of the self-defense aspect. Judo still has its kata, and they have their self-defense kata. But if you walk into most judo schools around the world, the emphasis is on the randori on the mat and the shiai, the competitions, including the Olympics. And there's only a passing acknowledgement. This is very different than pre-war judo. And I've discussed before about the fact that this is a reality that we have to accept because World War II changed everything, because when Japan lost the war and the Americans occupied Japan, all martial arts schools were closed, and anyone affiliated with Japanese militarism, faced challenges about whether they would be allowed to continue their existence. So, pre-war judo was very different. The competition was certainly there, and the emphasis at the core is the ability to do techniques live, throws, chokes, arm locks. Back then there was leg locks, but very much more an emphasis on self-defense and combat. I always point out that competition shiai, which is written in Japanese kanji a certain way now. Kano sometimes wrote as mutual death, because he wanted to stress that the randori method was not just a quote-unquote sport, but a way of making a classical martial art modern. And this will go back also a little bit when we talk about Shuai Jiao, the classical, kind of ritual, recreational, quote-unquote sport wrestling, and then, allows them to also have police and military self-defense application. But Judo became increasingly involved in the rising Japanese militarism. There is even a school of thought that Kano didn't die, but that he was poisoned or killed because he was ambivalent and somewhat against incorporating, Judo into, military training and becoming involved in this rising militarism, and they wanted to get rid of him. We can find pictures of Judo academies with racks of rifles in the background because, in addition to doing Kano's Judo, they were doing military training. And again, this is similar to what was going on in China when the Central Wushu was established, an increased militarism. And we should never forget that the martial arts that we practice now went through this period of time when they were part of a militarism in China, an attempt to militarize and invigorate a society to make up for the loss of position and the humiliations put upon it by the West. So, pre-war Judo, like I said, certainly had its rolling, but it also had a strong self-defense element with a combat element to it. And there were people involved in it that were very interested in doing challenges to prove the value of the methods that they had. In a way, they were defending Kano while not really using his name because they weren't sure how he would feel about these kind of rough and tumble, all-in competitions. With roots in pre-war Judo, it's not surprising to see that the Gracie family, when they evolved their methods, established 3 areas of study. And so the competition, the rolling on the mat and, the mats, and leads eventually to the International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation. Though, famously or infamously, Elio walked out of the meeting saying that the way they were going to arrange it as a sport was contradictory, with their points systems and everything, to the way that he saw the necessary competitive element to the training. He was for the competitive element, obviously, but he was not in it for the sport, at least in the format that ultimately became the International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation. Self-defense. In fact, Elio Gracie thought that the self-defense aspect was the most important aspect of Gracie family Jiu-Jitsu. And so when he had an opportunity to write a book, that master text that came out, it was not like spiderweb guards and a lot of ground stuff. It was the self-defense stuff. And we see now, like I said, modern quote-unquote Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a lot of, not all of them, but a lot of them have moved away from that tradition, but yet there's this urge to be returned to this tradition. You see it certainly with, Rickson Gracie, with his invisible jiu-jitsu, and Atkins, who's his student that does a version called hidden jiu-jitsu. We see it with the Horian Sons doing programs also to bring back the combat, and you see, them, running the school the way that the family originally wanted jiu-jitsu to be taught. And of course, the most controversial, the most famous, or the thing that really put the Gracie family on the map, so to speak, is the Vale Tudo, or the challenge fighting. Which history and development of, I said, is somewhat linked to these challenge matches, somewhat linked to the history of pro wrestling and carnival fighting, none of which we should be taken as pejorative. We're just talking about the fact that a certain culture and ethic and aesthetic developed, particularly in the early 20th century, that lent itself to creating, these challenge matches. In Chang's Shuai Jiao, Chang's Shuai Jiao, we see similar aspects developing, not surprisingly. Classical Shuai Jiao, that was done by the Sampuyi, and of course was useful for combat. I mean, even forget about when they were in the streets in the jungle and the potential, just picking somebody up and throwing them on the ground is a great combat skill. And for example, we have the Lei Tai competition where Wang Jiping won. Clearly his throws worked. He threw everybody and he won first place. But we also have that picture of him with the really, really bruised face. And I've talked about this before. That's because, it was classical Shuai Jiao. It was not what we think of now as combat Shuai Jiao, developing methods both against the striking and using the striking to close the distance. But classical Shuai Jiao could be used in combat. It was a good base for combat. It was a live training, and especially in Chinese martial arts, that was a big deal, because certainly a lot of other people were doing nothing but forms. Even in the Central Wushu Academy, this is a discussion here, like they set it up originally to create combat, capable and focus on combat application, but they got back into the mire, the quicksand of forms, except in the Shuai Jiao division and in the division that they created, which was sort of like Sino-sized boxing, Western boxing, but made almost like a Chinese martial art. With classical Shuai Jiao as a base, and Baoding tradition particularly being Chang's background, we start seeing developing, among other approaches, a kind of combat Shuai Jiao, which is, like I said, entries both against strikes and using strikes. And we certainly see Chang utilizing striking as part of his method. Some of that probably came from his grandmaster, when, like I said, when he established the Baoding school, incorporated, he said, Shaolin Chuan. Some of it came from striking methods for a generic that they taught at the Central Wushu, specifically Xingyi, which, people say, look at Chang's Xingyi, it's not orthodox. Yes, but from it he developed striking methods, and the consensus is clearly that you did not want to get hit by Chang. So, increasingly, modern Chang lineage Shuai Jiao has the classical training, the stand-up wrestling, which is why people from Chang's lineage are still able to go and compete in international Shuai Jiao competitions. They're able to go to China and compete. But it also has a particular emphasis on self-defense, particularly, including the police techniques, which we call daibushu, and I'm going to get there in a minute. You know what I'm going to say about that. And challenge fighting, which nowadays we sort of refer to as sanda. In Taiwan, it originally wasn't sanda. There's some politics there. Increasingly, they've just sort of gone with the flow and, accepting and calling it sanda, which is a kind of modern Valley Judo style or challenge style of fighting. So you can see already how Shuai Jiao has a lot of parallels going on. This is why I think that a lot of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu people would be interested in Shuai Jiao, Chang's lineage Shuai Jiao, especially as we're offering in the Chinese Shuai Jiao Association, that we're now opening up. And I think also, I'm going to talk about this, Shuai Jiao people, particularly those that are interested in doing it as a martial art, not just as a classical recreation or ritual practice, would be interested in cross-training in Gracie Jiu Jitsu. Today, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu people or Gracie Jiu Jitsu people, cross-training with Judo is very popular. It's completely understandable. I mean, again, they're cousin arts to begin with. They both are uniform grappling. Many Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools have excelled at the ground while being, weaker certainly than Judo, the modern Judo at the stand-up. They've also trained in Western wrestling, clearly, especially for their no-gi. But keeping all the points in mind that I've discussed up to this point, people particularly are interested in the original Gracie Jiu Jitsu approach and in keeping that aesthetic and those values, might consider, my thesis here in talking to you, training in Shuai Jiao, since it's so close to the pre-war judo that Gracie Jiu Jitsu came out of. And in fact, Chinese Shuai Jiao is directly influenced by pre-war judo. So it's not just a coincidence or, parallel development. In the Central Wushu Academy, as I've mentioned many, many, many times, pre-war judo was an influence. They sent people in 1930 to cross-train. At this point, Chang was a student there. In 1933, he became a member of the faculty, but he was training there. We know that elements of pre-war judo and other Japanese martial arts were a great influence on the Central Wushu Academy, including, of course, the Shuai Jiao program. Like Gracie Jiu Jitsu, modern Chinese Shuai Jiao has both jacket and no jacket training. I've been translating the police college material recently, somewhat backlogged in that, but that's another story. And what's notable about it, of course, is, not surprisingly, how it details with the jacket, this is how you grab. Without the jacket, this is how you grab. And if you look at Chang's manual, if you can find a copy of it, some of it's in a jacket and some of it's not in a jacket. Just like, people doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu have gi and no gi. Furthermore, Shuai Jiao jackets are short sleeve, meaning that Shuai Jiao has always had a variety of useful techniques that work both with and without uniform, things like arm drags and, arm manipulations and things like that. So, I would argue that one of the advantages of Shuai Jiao practicing stand-up with a jacket that is short sleeve is that you're getting sort of the best of both worlds. You have some elements in it that are clearly jacket wrestling. You have some elements in it that would be useful in wrestling without a jacket. Shuai Jiao, Chang style Shuai Jiao, also, like pre-war judo as opposed to modern judo, does not have a lot of the restrictions on the grips and the methods of attack and attacking the legs. I mean, modern judo increasingly is restricted. Shuai Jiao does not have that. You can learn all kinds of very useful methods, which, again, if you're interested in the martial art aspect, are going to be very useful. In recent years, like I said, the combat Shuai Jiao or Sanda has, in many respects, surpassed the early Gracie family Valley Tudo methods. Sanda, it became a very, not just developed in the military, but a very popular sport. China became very interested in MMA. People like myself. I mean, if you go back and look at the original Gracie tapes and you go back and look at some of the stuff that the Gracie family was doing, there's nothing wrong with it. And I would still say do it. But it's a smaller curriculum is what my argument would be. And, a little less developed. The current Sanda program that we have for the Chinese Shuai Jiao Association, I would argue is an excellent supplement or complement if you're doing a martial intended jiu-jitsu, like a Gracie family jiu-jitsu. And again, like I said, not all the schools, but clearly we know a lot of the schools, a lot of the jiu-jitsu schools, have almost lost these early kind of stand-up striking and against striking methods that the Gracie family developed for Valley Tudo. It just, some of them are doing it, some of them are sort of like, giving it that kind of slight acknowledgement, the same way that modern judo is, sort of winking at its self-defense aspect, but it's not a big focus. And it's rapidly being lost, and people like Hickson are, concerned about this as well. They should be. But again, like I said, we also know that cross-training would not just benefit Gracie Jiu-Jitsu people, would benefit us Shuai Jiao people as well. And everybody knows I've trained in Gracie Jiu Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, as well as a lot of other things. Our Daibushu, which is the police techniques, which is a Japanese term pronounced, by the Chinese, because they're originally Chinese characters, is very influenced by pre-war Judo. It's a Japanese term, but it's not as developed, obviously, as Gracie Jiu Jitsu. It has some techniques where we bring people to the ground and pin them. Master Jang showed some techniques where we follow up on the ground, but let's, not delude ourselves into thinking that Shuai Jiao has a well-developed ground program. Originally classical Shuai Jiao has no ground, but Chang's has some because of the military and police application. But it needs to be, ground was never correctly and completely addressed. And it should be if we want to give people a complete martial education. And so, I guess my argument or my talking point here is that the association right now, the Chinese Shuai Jiao Association, is willing to, open our doors and welcome in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academies that would like to incorporate some of this training. And like I said, I think there's a lot of benefit for them. And in the process, we would have access, obviously, to cross-training with them and improving ourselves as well. And as I've said in many occasions, in many different contexts, win-win situations win because they win for everybody. For Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academies, like I said, you're already using uniforms. You're already used to using belt systems. And when I'm talking about using uniforms, I know Shuai Jiao uniforms are short sleeve, and most Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are using, similar to Judo uniforms, which is long sleeve. As the current president of the association and the person, Chinese Shuai Jiao Association, and the person responsible for the curriculum development and the new membership programs, I think you could run a Shuai Jiao program and a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu program and never change the uniforms. Learn how to do all the Shuai Jiao throws and techniques and china and, everything, and just run it right alongside your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu program or your Gracie Jiu-Jitsu program. The sleeves are not going to make a huge difference. And in fact, we set up the program so it's white, yellow, green, and blue, and most Jiu-Jitsu, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu programs go white and blue. So, if you condense the program down so that, it was white, yellow, and green all in a quote-unquote white belt level, and then start blue material when somebody reaches blue belt in Jiu-Jitsu, that would work also. As I've said before, I'm always dealing with issues of, truth cannot be organized versus expedient means. So the program that we arranged is expedient means, it's not truth. And so therefore, if we modify it in any way, it's fine as long as we keep the idea of truth in the back of our minds, as we do this. And so along with this also, what I'm announcing is, our complimentary, subsidizing parallel Shuai Jiao Sanda program will be launching soon as well. And so if you're watching this and you're running a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu program or an academy, and you're saying, well, maybe I'd like to incorporate some Shuai Jiao into my school, I'd like to say to you that if you join also, we will include the Sanda program that we're going to launch soon. In with that, which, for you guys would be like an MMA or a Vale Tudo supplement to your training. I've said, in the letters that we first published when, we reactivated the association and I took over the leadership, we're interested in friends and we're interested in opening our doors and opening our arms. And so, we're not interested in keeping secrets. And so this is why, we have done this, and I think it's a great opportunity. And if you are someone, like I said, with a program or a school and you're interested in this, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm David Ross, and welcome once again to the Lion's Roar. And thank you for listening to me while I talked about the potential relationship between Chinese Shuai Jiao and Brazilian or Gracie Jiu Jitsu. Have a great night.